Hi KRB teachers, welcome to week 4 of the Maximize Mental Healthcare webinar series for KRB. Today we are looking at strengths, interests and values and how you can fully understand your students. A reminder of the 8-week webinar series of each of the topics, and of course today we are on the 4th topic on strengths, interests and values. So getting straight into the introduction, what are we going to be learning about today? Firstly, what are strengths and how are they defined? Secondly, how do you amplify these strengths in your students? Thirdly, what are interests? Fourthly, how do you encourage interest in your students? Fifthly, what are values? And then finally, how do you foster these values in your students? Here's a high-level summary of what that will look like. And of course, we'll close as always with a summary and resources. So starting with an overview. As mentioned, today we're talking about strengths, interests and values. And I want to point out that this is about understanding your students in particular. In week 6, we'll be exploring more self-awareness of your own strengths, interests and values as teachers, and how can you also understand your teaching style and how that may impact students as well. So to differentiate these two, today we're looking at interpersonal awareness, which is about learning between people. So how to help you to really understand your students. In week 6, when we look at intrapersonal awareness, this is about within people awareness. So how to really help you understand yourself. These two are both key skills that are important, and we'll cover this in terms of one of the forms of multiple intelligences which we discussed today in strengths. So how does this relate to KRB? Of course, you are aware of the Self Plus wellbeing framework that is advocated for students throughout King Koppel. Firstly, in terms of strengths, that's something that's covered throughout the whole framework, I believe, but in particular, as you can see here, highlighted under the learning in the L in Self Plus, character development. And we explore how that can really be carried out today in students above and beyond what you're already doing in that facet. The second one is interests. And again, it's part of that learning and how do you help promote curiosity and learning and those things like growth mindsets amongst students. And finally, values, a core bit of social, the S in Self Plus, and how do we help students to promote those core values both in themselves, in their academics and beyond. Again, another key element of the framework is about understanding self and beyond. Another reason why I highlighted those interpersonal versus intrapersonal awareness, the distinction there, because self-awareness is really fundamental as a thing to help promote students and yourselves in order to flourish, but also to help minimize things like mental illness. So as we can see here, character strengths are a particular focus for the Year 9-10 students, and so are core values. And also in terms of interests, the curiosity and interest does start all throughout school, of course, but also particularly in Year 11 and 12 as they're starting to think about where to after school and how do they understand themselves in relation to the world and carry through these sorts of interests and growth mindsets. Another key element is, of course, the framework that's underpinned by positive education, and a lot of what we do at Maximize with positive psychology. Here we can see that, again, the strengths and values is a key proponent of the character strengths that you already do. And also interests come under that element of grit, and one of key proponents of Angela Duckworth's research being interest as a fundamental element of having that grit. I also wanted to point out and start drawing your attention to the benefits of focusing on a strengths-based approach and this overview of positive education, positive psychology. And here already highlighted in the KRB's Self Plus framework is the benefit of the strengths-based approach in encouraging an optimistic approach that individuals get to utilize their abilities and develop capabilities that ultimately help them to perform at their best to flourish. And at the bottom, as you can see, it encourages positive student outcomes, success towards their goals, and a shared language for communicating in values with others. The final bit of the Self Plus is, of course, the plus, and that's the KIB difference as part of the Self Plus framework. Sacred Heart goals, clearly a unique factor of the framework, which is embedded throughout all of the students' lives at King Koppel and other Sacred Heart schools. The key ones here relating to intellectual values, but also Christian values. But values, as we'll explore, what more does that connotate beyond just these two values? Other bits in here that just wanted to draw your attention to was, of course, that curiosity and interest is woven throughout, and same with the strengths in terms of pursuing their talents. And again, those benefits here in building relationships across the world, increasing their sense of belonging, understanding their self in relation to the world, reaching the optimal state and flourishing, moving beyond just their individual world, and how to help prepare them for the world above and beyond school, building towards a better and more just future, and of course, a reminder again, allowing them to flourish within the wider world. So to summarise, how does KIB already think of the benefits, and why is such strengths-based approach so important? As I've already pulled out, but this is a summary as to what the language is already used in Self Plus framework. So as we explored, the benefits of doing a strengths-based approach, including also exploring students' interests and values, is that it helps them to utilise and develop their abilities. It can help them to perform at their best. It can encourage their positive student outcomes, and that could be however that they define, to therefore create greater success towards goals. It provides a shared language for communicating, which of course then that has that impact of sense of belonging and community, which is obviously so strong at King Koppel. Help them to reach the optimal state of flourishing, and what we call in psychology is being that state of flow, particularly when they're really finding their groove and what they're really interested and passionate about, which is very intrinsically motivating. Helps them to build relationships across the world, deepen their cultural knowledge and understanding. We covered the belonging, but also gain the understanding of self in relation to the world. I think those are some key points there. The main ones is that King Koppel prepares students not just for the HSC and Year 12 as the final testament of their abilities. It's actually about helping prepare them for the future and to be global citizens. And I think that's the difference and the benefit of what King Koppel does. And having this strengths-based approach allows for that more holistic education, which is so fundamental in promoting things, as I just said, about not only promoting mental well-being, but reducing that level of mental illness and that susceptibility. So further to that, these are some of the other reasons that we believe there's benefit to having a strengths-based approach and a positive psychology model. They're able to bring their whole selves to school. And we know this is the case and also in the workplace, is that when you're able to be yourself, you actually have better professional outcomes. And similarly, in the school environment, the same principles apply. So if they are really able to be their unique selves, they are able to thrive. They are also therefore able also to be and celebrate their most authentic, unique selves, which of course is good for not only themselves, but of course good for the school environment to have that diversity and genuine diversity and inclusion. They're able to thrive in a supportive environment. It boosts their confidence and motivation because they can celebrate themselves, their own unique strengths, interests, and values. Can foster personalised growth outside school, but not only that, also within, and advance their personal and academic goals. The research also says that they're able to more engage in more enjoyable extracurricular activities, which speaks to that holistic sense of well-being and growth that we mentioned before. Strengths also help to promote better decision-making, which go above and beyond just, again, school, but as we explored in the first webinar, the extra benefits outside of school of being mentally healthy, of course, things right from having lower divorce rates to being able to really thrive and contribute in their community. Make wiser academic choices, both during and post-school. So really for those Year 11 students, how do we help them to really hone into their strengths, interests and values to then start thinking about what is the next step after school? What do they want to study if they want to study? Where do they want to go? Where do they want to live? What do they want to do? And it reduces the incidence of mental illness disorders, as we've said, and promotes mental health and well-being. So these are, of course, some of the many range of benefits of the strengths-based approach. And when I say strengths-based, that's covering things like also focusing on their interests and values, because all of that can be tied up into how to promote themselves as unique individuals. This is all for students. So what about for you as teachers? What are the benefits for you of actually identifying and promoting strengths, interests and values in your students? Here are some of them. So firstly, it fosters a deeper connection between yourself and students, of course. If we know our students from everything from what they like to eat to what their favorite sport is to do to what do they really value and what are they really passionate about, that of course helps to foster that much richer connection with you, which we know is very positive and motivating for them as students. It helps you to have heightened empathy and perspective taking. It also helps to empower more confident, capable learners in the classroom, which of course can lead to academic benefits as well. It helps you to foster a nurturing learning environment and redirects behavioural challenges in the classroom. So for instance, if there is behavioural challenges that do come up, particularly for those younger years of high school, then how can you use and reinforce and reiterate to students what you already know to be their strengths and interests and try and diffuse and navigate trickier situations like that by virtue of being across these abilities in students. It's also good in the more extreme case when you have effective conflict resolution, and that goes not just between yourselves and the students, but also between students and their relationships between their peers at school, which of course we know, particularly being at an all-girls school, there are behavioural challenges which are inevitable, but how can you help them to remind them of their strengths and their abilities in navigating those trickier times and use that to help diffuse again those trickier situations, which of course issues in social, minimising those can also minimise the impact that could potentially have on them pursuing and achieving their greatest academic potential. And finally, you get to benefit them from having the diverse and unique contributions and ideas. And when we really understand individually what are people's interests and ideas and what is their uniqueness, that helps to not only benefit themselves, also yourself and have different perspectives and be across what their abilities are, but also helps the broader dynamic of the room and the group and classroom to learn from one another, which of course is always good for academic success. To recap from last week, we talked about warning signs requiring attention to changes. And I did mention then how we were going to cover more about how to do this in this week's webinar. So the reason why we are then covering the students' strengths, interests and values, or one other reason, is of course we can only spot changes in our students if we really know them in the first place. So that's another reason why it's excellent to understand them and who are they? Who are they authentically? What is unique about them in terms of these strengths, interests and values? And therefore, it's much easier to spot when the changes happen, which can then be, as we talked about, potentially indicative of mental illness disorders. So that's a benefit to why we're looking at the strengths, values and interests. And a reminder to about being hyper observant, so really attending to them, Students won't necessarily always tell you what they're interested in or what their strengths are, and particularly girls, they struggle with communicating those, which is why as teachers you are in such a powerful position to be in so much contact with them, to be observing them, and to help identify for them what are their strengths and interests and values, but also observing without them necessarily telling you. And we did look at that last week, as to really attending to their facial cues, behavioural gestures, and tone. I just wanted to show you one technique that we use at Maximinds as a high level strategy, which is got same principles of cognitive behavior therapy, which, as we talked about, is the predominant psychotherapy that we use as psychologists, and the same principles of trying to help students to thrive, to be their best selves and really feel like they're able to contribute as individuals and thrive. This is a technique called Ikigai, and it's a Japanese term, and I think it's a good way to demonstrate the concepts that we're going to be talking about today as well. So I'll just play that for you.
Another important Japanese concept is the idea of Ikigai. It roughly translates to one's life meaning or purpose. You can aid your students in finding their Ikigai by drawing 4 intersecting circles. In one circle, ask them to identify what they are good at. In another circle, ask them to identify what they enjoy doing. And in the third circle, focus on what the world needs. And in the final circle, explore what you can get paid for. It encourages students to reflect on their passions, strengths, and interests to discover their own Ikigai. This self-discovery process can inspire a sense of fulfillment and purpose, contributing to their mental well-being.
So I think the intersecting 4 circles has been inspiration for how we look at Maximinds, the important 3 components, and that we're going to talk about today, being strengths, interests, and values. So at this stage, I think as a more broad approach, working out now what they can get paid for and what the world needs is probably more closely aligned to that years 11 and 12. But for a more general high school for KIB, strengths, interests, and values can apply across all levels. So we're looking today at, of course, these 3, and how do we help you to understand what they are, and also how to identify and promote these things in your students. The green star in the middle, I think, as we had for the previously with mental illness and mental health, having the intersection of those 3 things, about having strengths, interests, and values, and able to really promote these in students, really allows them to thrive and be both mentally healthy but also academically successful. So to start with, what are strengths and how are they defined in a positive psychology framework? So to define strengths, character strengths are the positive parts of your personality that impacts how you feel, think, and behave. And this comes from the VIA Institute on Character, which is, of course, one of the many tools that Kinkoppel uses in the Self Plus framework on promoting character development. The key 3 components here are talents, skills, and capabilities. So talents are the unique, individual, exceptional abilities and aptitudes. So things like potentially musical, artistic, athletic. Skills are acquired proficiencies and expertise in specific areas. So that might be a particular skill in writing, public speaking, problem solving in maths, for instance. And capabilities, an innate or developed capability to perform tasks effectively. So these might include things like leadership, more critical thinking, adaptability. One of the models of psychology that we were taught very early on is Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. And a reminder that we spoke about interpersonal before versus intrapersonal. And today, of course, we're focusing on the interpersonal. In addition to those, there's visual spatial, linguistic verbal, logical mathematical, musical, bodily kinesthetic, naturalistic. So simplistically, this might be for visual spatial, might be the students that are particularly good at art, D&T. Linguistic verbal, they might really have strengths in English. Logical, mathematical is obviously mathematical, science. Musical is musical. Bodily, kinesthetic might be PHBE, but also drama, for instance. And naturalistic, maybe more things like geography. Another way to define strengths is according to Don Clifton, who is regarded as the father of strengths psychology. And he first proposed what would happen if we studied what was right with people versus what's wrong with people. And I particularly resonate with this as a psychologist. Of course, you can get inundated with focusing on mental illnesses and the disorders, that, as you will hopefully have seen by now, the idea is really to focus on the positive element of psychology and understanding the potential. And I think that really aligns with how KRB also thinks of how to promote a growth mindset and focus on the good, and also what can be achieved in that strengths. So their theory, his theory, which then developed into Gallup research, and his contribution to that was, how does each person have greater potential for success in specific areas? And they believe that the key to human development is building on who you already are. So really understanding what are those initial dominant talents or traits, and then adding skills, knowledge, and practice. So the Gallup Strengths Finder, which we will talk about in terms of how do we promote strengths shortly, but they spoke about strengths as talent times investment. So it's really this multiplier effect that, yes, there's that innate ability, arguably, but then there's also the ability to invest time, practice, build the skills in order to ultimately build a strength. So an example they speak about in this book, which I will reference shortly because I think it's excellent and great tool to encourage students to use, but also you for personally for teachers, is the example of Michael Jordan. So for instance, he had an innate talent, plus he invested a huge amount of time and energy, and hence why his key strength was basketball. By the same vein, his initial innate talent in having that basketball expertise, if he didn't invest in that, for instance, but instead chose to do golf, may not necessarily have had that innate talent, but spent a lot of time doing it, he would never necessarily have the best strength as a golf player. So it's really about that age-old saying is playing to your strengths, and the ability of being able to spot strengths initially, and then build on them is far more advantageous, the argument is from Gallup, than trying to fix, inverted commas, or develop weakness areas. The benefit far outweighs focusing on strengths. Their model is actually done in a 5x5 matrix, and they say to investment for basketball, he was then say a 25. If he was to try and be a great strength, have a great strength in being a golf player, he may not have had that talent. It could have been a 3. Even if he still put in just as much time, he'd be a 15, but he's never going to be a 25 compared to, say, Tiger Woods, who had the talent and the investment. So it's really about finding out who our girls are, what are their innate strengths, and that goes back to that nature debate, the talent, the underlying talent. Yes, we're all born with some extra talents and things that are unique to us. Start with that, and then use your time wisely to promote. How do we promote those strengths to any greater advantage? By the same virtue, as you probably know with some students, if they've got all the potential in the world and yet they don't put the time and effort in practice, then they're still going to be a 5 or a 10, down that bottom right category. So how do we identify their strengths and help them build on it to really amplify and be the best versions that they can be? So how do we do that? How do we promote strengths in our girls? As mentioned, KRB uses VIA character strengths and the Institute on Character. This is an excellent tool because it's free. It applies to young people, and you can do the youth assessment and get a report there. And it's got some really simple and easy categories to learn from. So if you haven't already, or if you're not across your students' strengths, which ones, I would encourage them to do it, and then help you to identify which ones are really advantageous to you as teachers, and particularly how we can use those in their particular subject with you, or how to help them use those strengths to overcome challenges, deal with stresses or exam pressures and things like that. As you see here, here's the VIA Youth Character Strengths Report, and I'll be particularly encouraging parents to do this. I think this one is a paid one on top of the generic VIA character strengths, but this will give them a profile of how they can look at their top 5 strengths and in depth what it means and why it matters, and in particular, how to amplify it. So I like that flex your strength to really build on it, exactly as we talked about before. It's all very well to be kind, but then how do you actually spend the time practicing developing that skill ultimately? One example of how we use this as a tool online for students, and therefore we've repurposed it for you teachers, is of course to do a mini exercise in class, such as the following.
As teachers, you can help students recognise their unique strengths and abilities. You can encourage them to identify their personal strengths by reflecting on what they excel at, or even asking for feedback from others. It could be their creativity, problem-solving skills, kindness, or leadership qualities. By understanding and embracing their strengths, students can cultivate self-confidence, set meaningful goals, and promote their mental well-being.
So further to that, how can you specifically promote and apply strengths in the classroom? So these are some examples that have come from either the literature, previous experience, that have proven to help promote those strengths in students and young people particularly. So for instance, in English, something that English teachers could do, discuss the characters' strengths in the texts and really explore characters from a strengths-based perspective. They could use their own personal strengths in creative writing, because of course, if they are their key strength is, say, kindness, then they're of course one of the best people to write about how does that feel, or therefore not feel. How can you use that in terms of building a creative writing narrative? In maths, things like, bring up maths particularly because there's a huge amount of maths anxiety, and there's a lot of literature done on that particularly, which I do think is one of the biggest contributors to things like anxiety in teenage girls, is that fear of maths and that they're not necessarily expected to perform there as highly as boys. I think that's changing, of course, with the huge focus on STEM and women in STEM. But for instance, there's studies that have pointed out that focusing on for instance, those students that might have more of an inverted commas English mind, or that linguistic that we just explored before, they tend to benefit when it comes to those problem solving questions. And you might find, of course, the ones that tend to be naturally very good at the maths and the numbers really struggle with those problem solving questions. When it means there's lots of words, they have to come up with an algebraic equation or something like that to interpret that question. Those linguistic students naturally perform better there. So really focusing on that and pointing out that yes, they can thrive in maths even if they're not necessarily maths minded. Religion, obviously a huge part of KRB, and how can you point out as religion teachers, for instance, how can you parallel students' strengths to Christianity's 10 Commandments? And I do think by virtue of being at a Catholic and Christian school, this is particularly advantageous for all of the students. So this is something that can be applied across the board, because KRB is obviously very successful in its promotion of religion, but also the values that they carry out, and that by extension the community are bound by those fundamental commandments, which focus on acting in the right way, and using, for instance, the 10 Commandments could be one approach there. PDHPE, a study was focused on how strengths were used to help team members refocus and point out what they did individually and collectively on the field to really foster things like consistent play, and they ended up performing better over time as a result of that focus on what they did well. ESL and languages, another study was that found that bilingual students are naturally more creative, so pointing out that that's something they can use to their advantage in that class. Another study also explored character strengths in the context of cultures, and really helped to almost personalize that that for them, and how they can also therefore relate to that and understand how it relates to them, and how they, by doing this study, how that can also help transcend their strengths beyond school, outside. Geography. You could explore and encourage the modelling of strengths and uniqueness of cultures. A book particularly, and this doesn't just apply for geography teachers, but The Geography of Bliss is an excellent book that goes around and looks at the strengths almost in every cultures, and looked at, for instance, high-paying lawyers in New York City and very, very poor communities in the slums of India, and found ultimately who was happiest. I won't ruin, I hope I won't ruin it by telling you, of course, those in the most unwealthy places in India were in fact far happier than the high-paying, high-flying lawyers in New York City. But using that to also redefine what is actually success and happiness, and how strengths can also contribute to that. And part of that, not to spoil, but part of that is the strength of the community, and focus on how they work together as a community was so empowering, for instance, in the slums. And finally, saying music. This was another study they promoted resilient strengths in students after they had perceived to have poor performances, and that helped to build optimism and increase their performances going forward. So there's some examples of how that could apply specifically. As mentioned, Clifton Strengths, I think, is an excellent tool in addition to VIA. This one is rigorous, I think, perhaps more psychometrically valid and reliable than, for example, the VIA character strength. This is something more that I will be encouraging parents to use, but also good for you to know as teachers, something to consider. There's a student version. There's also an adult version if you're personally interested. And as you can see here, they have both an outline of the top 5 strengths, but also really go into depth of how this can contribute to your strengths, and how you can continue to develop and build those strengths. Also good to look at how this can also get in the way of your success. So the theory here is that it's good to just be aware and cognizant that strengths can also be weaknesses, and by reverse, weaknesses can also be huge strengths. So an example there might be and I think this is something particularly for someone with a mental illness disorder, the hyperactivity that we looked at, for instance, with ADHD last week. Hyperactivity, of course, and being very on the go and buzzing around can in some situations be seen as a development area or something to really focus and rein in. But of course, my perspective is that was a huge strength, because having that hyperactivity and that energy has been found to result in greater creativity. It also has greater problem solving abilities, and there's been a lot of work done at Stanford to that effect. So I think that's something else to think about. This is a book that, again, I'll be asking parents to look at for students, but there is an adult version. We'll be looking at that for you in the 2 weeks' time when we look at how do you develop your own intrapersonal awareness. As a psychologist, the best tool that I use when I put together reports for students is the Saville Myself report, and this is administered by psychologists and then interpreted and played back to students. As you can see, there's just that extra level of detail. It's done in a way that uses an ipsative questionnaire, which it's that forced ranking, which we all hate when we do questionnaires, but that does prove to be more valid and reliable. And so therefore, I think it's the most accurate predictor of strengths. So for instance, it'll give them those signature strengths and then give them really in detail how to know them, their cultural fit, how to maximize them, using them wisely. And a competitive advantage, this is, for example, an interview, but how they can use them themselves. Something, again, I'll be showing to parents, but for those that are involved in career guidance and assessment, the most interesting part, I think, of this particular report is that it maps those strengths according to professions. So it will link, well, what are the key strengths that are needed for what are the key strengths that come out on the student's report, and then map them to which ones that would be most suitable. So that's another tool for promoting and developing strengths in students. So on to what are interests. Well, interests are activities, hobbies, pursuits, pastimes, and or subjects that engage students' attention, concern, and or curiosity. Some examples here, whether they be interest for a student in sport, socialising, and inevitably social media, which is currently a huge interest amongst teenage girls. On an extreme level of interest, there is something called flow. You may be familiar with the concept, but basically it's a state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. The experience is so enjoyable that people continue to do it even at great cost for the sheer sake of doing it. You may have experienced this yourself. It's the feeling that when you look up and the time's just passed, so you've been so engaged in it. And those are the sorts of things I think on an extreme level for our students that we want to know, what do they really love? What are they really, really passionate about that they spend so much time doing that they just pop up after a while and realize how much time's passed. Other sorts of interests as terms of categories are a range of things here. This is not an exhaustive list, but things such as creative pursuits, academic subjects, particular ones they may really like and gravitate to, sport and exercise, colour and the arts, so cooking, baking, things like that, performing arts, drama and things like that, being in the outdoor activities, hiking, technology, which of course would include things like social media, but also gaming, social activities, that could also be doing things in a social community or volunteering, literature and reading, and travel and exploration. The most popular amongst teenage girls are social media, fashion and beauty, and music. And these are probably not necessarily surprising to you. Somewhat concerning, I guess, the rise of social media and just how much time is spent on that. But if you were to ask teenage girls what are their hobbies, most students seem to hate that question, but they would probably tell you this is where they spend a lot of their time outside of things like school. So if we look onto some literature, so John Holland was an American psychologist at Johns Hopkins University, and he looked at these 6 categories of interests. So realistic, those ones that tend to involve working with hands, more physical. Investigative, reading and thinking about solutions to problems. Artistic, creative talents. Social, helping and teaching others. Enterprising, holding a position of power, and conventional, so keeping records and doing computations. And the reason I bring this up is I will show you how this can be a way to apply and encourage interest in students shortly. But these already at this stage may make you think of the multiple intelligence that we explored earlier from Gardner's theory. For instance, realistic sounds a little bit like the bodily kinesthetic that we looked at already. Similarly, investigative, perhaps like linguistic, verbal, artistic, visuospatial, social, interpersonal. Enterprising doesn't necessarily have one, but tends to be those that are more self-aware and have that interpersonal awareness. And conventional, the logical, mathematical. This is not to say, though, of course, that strengths are the same as interest. I think that's probably important to call out, that even if students are good at something, they may not necessarily like doing it. And vice versa, they may like doing something, but they're not necessarily good at it. So it's good to really explore what are students' strengths and interests independently. And as we looked at that multiplying matrix earlier, the best case scenario is when they're able to do something that they are, and then do something they enjoy that they're also really good at. And that's when we get success. So on to encouraging interest. How do you do this in your students? As I just said before, these are the 6 types of interest that Holland defines, and that is part of a broader psychometric assessment that we use called the self-directed search. This helps students to identify not only what are their interests, but in tandem, what are their competencies and how they self-report those, and what sorts of activities do they enjoy that could align to certain occupations. So this is a broader thing that will go above and beyond what most of you as classroom teachers may need to use. This is probably more for career advice and career advisory and places like that. However, I did want to show this is a way that we use this to gauge interests in a psychometric way. How this particular psychometric assessment works is that it gives then students a code to find out what are their 3 top areas of interest and capabilities in terms of career suitability. So to give you an example, I've highlighted how teacher and being a teacher typically maps onto codes that start with an S because of that social element that we looked at just before. So this can help also students to be aware of their interests above and beyond just their school, but also to start to look to goals for the future. So how do we encourage these interests in the classroom? And how is this relevant for you as teachers? So the key things to note here is probably to bring students' interests into the syllabus and teaching by using analogies and parallels. So how can you take the student outcomes that you're already doing and incorporate somehow the interests that you know are both unique to individuals in your classroom, but also collective amongst the cohort. Also encourage students to share their interests to create commonalities amongst peers and overcome relationship challenges. Research suggests that when we are similar to someone and have an overlapping interest or commonality, could even be physical appearance, we do tend to like them more. So that can help build those almost bridges that are necessary, particularly in girls that have some of those conflicts. As teachers, you can also incorporate the interest in lessons to encourage and motivate students. They would be more likely to find topics that aren't necessarily as interesting to them interesting if there is some sort of relevancy and parallel to their own interests outside of the class. Discussing interests and demonstrating genuine interest in them and their interests to build stronger relationships with them. Obviously, you probably already know from your personal experience, when you do have a good relationship with your students, the outcomes tend to be better, both for them individually and also obviously for the cohesion of the class. And finally, and I do this as a tutor myself as well, using interests as incentives or rewards, so that positive reinforcement for desired behaviour or action. So if you do X, then you can do Y, which aligns more with their interests. And why? What are the benefits really for you? Overall, these are some of the benefits that we found from the research when you do have that greater bond and connection between yourself and your students. So going from the bottom left around, you're seen as more human to them. You're able to elicit more respect from them as well. You therefore become more approachable and relatable to them, and they see you more of an equal, which tends to be better in some situations, obviously, but at least it creates that camaraderie between yourself and students when there's that overlap and likeness. I'm just going to show you a final video that we use as Maximize as a technique for students and then have repurposed it for you, just at a high level as to how you could do this in class.
Each student has different interests and activities they enjoy. As teachers, you can encourage them to create a list of things they enjoy doing. This could be reading for some people. This could be swimming for others, baking for some people, or anything else that they enjoy. Encourage students to revisit this list when they are feeling down or need a bit of a mood boost. Engaging in activities they enjoy can significantly contribute to their mental well-being.
And finally, what are values? Values are your heart's deepest desires for how you want to behave as a human being. Values are not just about what you want to get or achieve, but how you want to behave or act on an ongoing basis, how you want to treat yourself, others, and the world around you. And this is a quote from Russ Harris, who is a big proponent and trainer of ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy, the type of psychotherapy that we use, and it will map onto values, and I'll show you that in a second. Other ways to think of values: core principles and beliefs for guiding behaviour. And here's a list of, say, 5 different overarching topics. So things like honesty and having a commitment to truthfulness, integrity, and sincerity. A value for responsibility, being accountable for one's own actions and obligations. Compassion, showing empathy, kindness, and concern for others. Equality, a belief in fairness and equal opportunities for all. And then respect, treating others with consideration, dignity, and acceptance. As I mentioned just before, I wanted to introduce you to ACT. And this is different to CBT, which we've already looked at last week and the previous week. So cognitive behaviour therapy is teaching people, and particularly students, to look at their thoughts, feelings, and behaviour and the interaction between the three. So the cognitive bit is obviously the thoughts and the feelings, and the behaviour is behaviour, and therapy looks at the interplay between those things. So it's really about how to better control the interaction of what happens there. On the other hand is this thing called ACT, which is called acceptance and commitment therapy. And the reason I bring this in is it's got to do with values. So unlike CBT, which is about controlling those thoughts and trying to change behaviours and the interplay between the two, ACT is about accepting and embracing the thoughts and letting them pass rather than trying to fight them or challenge them. So it teaches people how to just notice. And as you can see here, it's almost metacognitive in terms of it's thinking about the thinking. It's like, oh, interesting, there's that thought. The reason I'm introducing this as a big part of ACT is that it's about emphasizing behaving in a way that's consistent with values. So that may be the goals, life directions, or otherwise. So in the context of students and what we're talking about here, what we want to do is really encourage these values that are underlying and that are always almost enduring in students, as well as values of yourselves and schools, and how we can act in accordance with them that are consistent and use that as a tool to help foster different behaviours and desired behaviours and actions that you're looking for and expecting as teachers in the classroom. So how do we actually foster these values? As we've looked at earlier, Kinkoppel obviously is bound by Sacred Heart goals, or as I think of them, values as well. So a personal and active faith in God, a deep respect for intellectual values, the building of community, a social awareness, which impels to action and personal growth in an atmosphere of wise freedom. You're obviously very familiar across all of these. So this is important to note that this is overarching values that sit as almost like the umbrella within where you are as the teachers of Kinkoppel, and then also where students also are expected to align with these goals or values. I did want to point out that that is at the top almost of the pyramid that I've done here. You will also have your own personal classroom values. So in addition to what we've already looked at, those might be, and these are just some examples, that you might have values that, you think it's important to have equal contributions from student, treat others with respect, hand homework in on time, and work hard. That is at that middle level. Then for the individuals, they will also have their own personal values, which sit underneath, hopefully, and support exactly what you're already expecting and have values as at your level as a teacher, but also at the school. But they would also be influenced by things like home life, the other interactions that happen outside the school environment. And as mentioned, these values are the deepest desires that are typically enduring throughout life and that hold true right from when we're young to well past school. As an example, they may have values, for instance, about balance and that between work and play. They may also value extracurricular activities above schoolwork. They also may value, for instance, science more than their visual arts homework. They also may value family demands as priority. These are just examples, just to show you that there could be potentially conflicts and there could be consistencies. And it's just more to be mindful that there's going to be different values at different levels, whether you're looking at the school-wide, classroom, or individual, which is obviously influenced by those external outside forces. So how do we really foster the values in the classroom? I think it's about continuing to instill the KIB Sacred Heart goals in your students, role modeling them yourselves, but also your own personal classroom values. And finally, respecting the many and varied values that they will also have as students and that they will then place priority on. Underlying all of that, I think it's about reminding students of the school, classroom, and their personal values when encouraging expected behaviour and action from them. And I think this is just another avenue to use as teachers to help guide the behaviour that we're expecting. So, for instance, handing homework in on time and drawing upon their values, because they're not going to change, remember, they're the more enduring things. So reminding them that why do we do homework and what's the importance of that? Well, because the value that we have at school and as a Sacred Heart community is to have that intellectual value and that emphasis placed on intellectual value. So reminding them of those bigger, broader things that are also then hopefully consistent within their own personal values, and use that as well to help achieve what needs to be in the classroom as teachers. One key technique that we use at Maximinds is a ACT, or Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, values page, as you can see here. So there is 58 as part of the ACT model that Russ Harris is a trainer in, and that would get the students to identify which of these values would they rate as very important to them, and then ultimately to help identify which values are then most important. And this is something that you could also give to students to remind them and reiterate back to those real origins of what do they stand for, what are their values, what are their real fundamental priorities, to help in the classroom as well. You can then use these, for instance, to help then set SMART goals or develop wellness wheels to help with relating to academia. So, for instance, if they've identified a fundamental value, which might be, say, challenge, and that's number 7, challenge, that's important to them, as one of the most important things to them, then you can help weave those values into developing SMART goals which relate to their academics. A reminder that values are the enduring and arguably most powerful tool in order to elicit that engagement and complete alignment with where students have their priorities. On the right is also another CBT technique that we use, which is wellness wheels. So it looks at where we are now, where's the current, and then also where they want to go. Another tool or technique that you could use with students in helping them to firstly indicate where they are on the current, so they would shade in different levels, use on each of the different domains, and then using that same amount of levels they've done, they can then put that onto the future and reprioritize. So it really force ranks them and helps them to reprioritize, well, what do they want to do going forward? And hopefully that means that they're wanting to contribute more to intellectual from your perspective, but sometimes it is about obviously taking a step sideways and perhaps working on their physical health or their emotional while they're still then developing on their intellectual. And by the same token, sometimes it might be that you'll see that they have overflowed with intellectual and they've put so much emphasis and stress because of the exams coming up that other things are suffering, and how do you help to reprioritize? So these are not meant to be long, arduous activities, but potentially some that you might want to use and you have access to on Maximinds if you want to download them. So to summarise, what have we learnt today? Hopefully we've learnt that strengths are positive parts of students' personality that will impact how they feel, think and behave, and include things like talents, skills and capabilities. You can amplify strengths in students by encouraging conversation and application of their VIA character strengths in your subjects and also in your conversations with them. Interests are activities, hobbies, pursuits, pastimes and or subjects that engage students' attention, concern and curiosity. You can encourage interests in students by involving them in your teaching and lessons and referencing them to build commonalities between students and their peers, but also between yourself and them. And you can also use them as incentives. Values are deep desires, core principles and beliefs for guiding students' behaviour. You can foster values as teachers by instilling and role modelling the Sacred Heart goals and respecting students' individual values as well. I'll just ask you to scan the code if you wouldn't mind completing one question for me, just to give us some feedback, and ask any questions. If you need any clarification, I'll just give you 20 seconds. Finally, resources. As always, emergency contacts if you need them. A reminder that you have access to Maximise 24/7 access for 3 months. If you would like to sign up, that is totally free. And there is a QR code for you to access that. And I encourage you to go on and have a look at those activities that we looked at today, and also some strategies that you can use in real time with your students. Thank you, and see you next week.